The scream cut through Riverside University's evening air like shattered glass. Connor Hayes froze. His weathered fingers tightened around the radio clipped to his security uniform. 30 yards away, 3 massive hockey players circled a young woman like predators. Books exploded across the asphalt, papers scattered in the autumn wind. The girl hit the concrete hard. Connor's combat instincts erupted. His boots pounded against the pavement as he charged forward, every muscle memory from Afghanistan flooding back. "Back off! Now!" His voice carried the authority of a man who'd faced real enemies. The attackers melted away like shadows, but when the auburn-haired girl looked up at him, Connor's blood turned to ice. Those emerald eyes weren't filled with gratitude or relief. They held recognition, as if she'd been expecting him all along. The designer laptop clutched in her trembling hands, the pristine textbooks worth more than his monthly salary. Everything screamed wealth and privilege. Yet something darker lurked beneath her polished surface, something that whispered this wasn't random at all. Connor extended his calloused hand to help her up, noting how she flinched slightly before accepting his assistance. "You hurt?" he asked, his voice softer now, paternal instincts kicking in. The girl dusted off her expensive jeans with practiced grace, movements too refined for a typical college freshman. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice carrying an accent that spoke of private tutors and finishing schools. "I'm fine." But she wasn't fine. Connor could see it in the way her shoulders tensed, the way her eyes darted toward the dormitory buildings as if calculating escape routes. "Those boys give you trouble before?" Connor asked, gathering her scattered papers. Philosophy textbooks, advanced literature, impressive reading for someone barely out of high school. Her laptop screen displayed what looked like a business proposal, far too sophisticated for undergraduate coursework. "Sometimes," she admitted, avoiding his gaze. "I'm different from the other students here." Different was an understatement. Everything about her screamed money and careful cultivation, yet here she was at a state university, apparently alone and vulnerable. Connor had seen enough scared kids in his 3 years working campus security to recognize the signs. But this girl was different. The way she held herself, the quality of her clothing, even the way she spoke, it all suggested a background that didn't match her current circumstances. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Zoe," she replied after a moment's hesitation. Just Zoe. No last name, no elaboration. Another red flag in Connor's mental catalogue. As he walked her toward the dormitories, Connor found himself studying her profile. High cheekbones, perfect posture, an air of breeding that money couldn't buy, only generations of privilege could create. Yet there was something fragile about her, something that reminded him of his own daughter Harper's struggles with fitting in. "You know," he said carefully. "If those boys bother you again, you can find me. Connor Hayes, Night Security, Radio Channel 7. Zoe nodded, then surprised him by asking, "Do you have children, Mr. Hayes?" The question caught him off guard. "One daughter. 19, just like you, I'd guess." Something shifted in Zoe's expression, a flash of longing so brief he almost missed it. "She's lucky," Zoe said quietly, "having a father who protects people." There was weight behind those words, a story Connor sensed she wasn't ready to tell. As they reached her dormitory, she turned back once, those emerald eyes studying him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Not in a bad way, but in the way that told him this encounter would change things. He just didn't know how yet. Connor's radio crackled to life as he watched Zoe disappear into the building. "Unit 7, status report." His supervisor's voice cut through the evening air. "All clear, dispatch, minor disturbance resolved." But even as he spoke the words, Connor knew nothing about this was minor. The way Zoe had looked at him, The expensive items she carried so casually, the careful way she'd answered his questions, it all added up to something he couldn't quite grasp. Something that would keep him awake long after his shift ended. The next evening brought Connor back to his routine patrol, but his mind kept drifting to the auburn-haired girl. Harper had texted earlier about struggling with her psychology coursework, another reminder of how hard college could be for kids trying to find their place. At 42, Connor understood loneliness better than most. 3 years since Margaret's death, 3 years of raising Harper alone while trying to keep his own demons at bay. The night security job paid enough to cover their modest apartment and Harper's therapy sessions. Barely. Some days he wondered if he was doing right by his daughter, if she needed more than a broke ex-soldier could provide. His thoughts scattered when he spotted a familiar figure in the library's 24-hour study area. Zoe sat alone at a corner table, surrounded by textbooks that seemed far too advanced for freshman coursework. Business law, international economics, strategic management. The kind of books Connor had seen in his brief stint as a corporate security consultant. Books that cost hundreds of dollars each. Through the glass, he watched her take notes in what looked like perfect calligraphy, every letter formed with the precision of someone who'd had expensive education. Connor found himself pushing through the library doors, drawn by something he couldn't name. Maybe it was the way she sat so perfectly straight, or how she glanced nervously toward the entrance every few minutes. Maybe it was simply that she reminded him of Harper in her more vulnerable moments. "Late night studying?" he asked, approaching her table with careful steps. Zoe looked up, and for a moment her carefully controlled expression cracked. Relief flooded her features before she caught herself. "I prefer the quiet hours," she said, gesturing to the empty library around them. "Less crowded." The way she said it suggested she meant more than just physical space. Connor glanced at her textbooks again, noting titles that would challenge graduate students. "Heavy reading for a freshman," he observed. Zoe's hand moved protectively over her notes, but not before Connor caught glimpses of what looked like business correspondence. Professional letterhead, legal terminology, numbers with too many zeros. "I've always been ahead academically," Zoe said carefully. "My mother insisted on rigorous preparation." The way she said "mother" carried weight, formality that spoke of relationships built on expectations rather than warmth. Connor found himself wondering what kind of family produced a girl like this. Brilliant, polished, yet somehow desperately lonely. "Your father in business?" he asked casually. Zoe's expression shuttered completely. "I don't have a father," she said with finality that ended that line of questioning. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, Connor's presence seeming to ease some tension Zoe carried. Finally, she spoke again. "Your daughter, is she happy here?" The question surprised him with its intensity. "She's finding her way," Connor said honestly. "College is tough when you're trying to figure out who you are." Zoe nodded, as if this resonated deeply. "Sometimes I wonder what it would be like," she said quietly. "To just be a normal student. To worry about normal things." Connor studied her profile, noting the way her shoulders relaxed slightly as she spoke. Whatever normal meant to Zoe, it clearly wasn't her current reality. "What kind of things do you worry about?" he asked gently. Zoe was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "About people wanting to know me for the wrong reasons, about never knowing if someone cares about me or what I represent." The vulnerability in her words hit Connor like a physical blow. Before he could respond, Zoe's phone buzzed against the table. The caller ID read simply, "Office," but the way Zoe's entire demeanor changed told Connor this wasn't any ordinary call. "I have to take this," she said, her polished mask sliding back into place. She stepped away, speaking in hushed tones, but Connor caught fragments. Maintaining low profile, security protocols, cannot afford exposure. When she returned, any trace of vulnerability had vanished. "I should go," she said, gathering her expensive textbooks with practiced efficiency. Connor watched her leave, his mind spinning with questions. Security protocols? Low profile? What kind of freshman needed to worry about exposure? As he continued his patrol, one thought kept circling back. Zoe wasn't just different from other students. She was hiding something big, something that explained the expensive items, the advanced coursework, the careful way she spoke about her life. Something that made his protective instincts sing with warning bells he couldn't quite understand. The weekend brought an unexpected encounter that would shift everything. Connor was grabbing coffee at the campus cafe when he heard a familiar voice calling his name. "Mr. Hayes." Zoe approached with something that looked almost like excitement, a rare crack in her usually controlled demeanor. "I was hoping I'd run into you." She gestured toward a corner table where another young woman sat studying. "I'd like you to meet my friend Harper." Connor's heart stopped. His Harper sat at that table, psychology textbooks spread around her like a fortress. When she looked up and saw him, confusion flickered across her features. "Dad, what are you doing here?" The word dad seemed to hit Zoe like a physical blow. Her emerald eyes went wide, darting between Connor and Harper with something approaching panic. "Your daughter is Harper Hayes?" she asked, her voice strangely hollow. "You two know each other?" Connor asked, settling into the chair beside Harper. His daughter's expression was odd, studying Zoe with new interest. "We're in Literature 101 together," Harper explained. "Zoe's brilliant. She always has the best analysis in class." But there was something else in Harper's tone, something that suggested their connection went deeper than shared coursework. "We've been study partners for a few weeks now," Zoe added quietly. Her earlier excitement completely vanished. Connor watched the interplay between the two girls, noting how Harper seemed more animated than she'd been in months. Since Margaret's death, Harper had struggled with depression and anxiety, making few friends and withdrawing from social activities. Seeing her engaged and apparently happy sent relief flooding through Connor's chest. "Zoe's been helping me with my essays," Harper continued. "She has this way of seeing themes I completely miss, and Harper's been showing me what normal college life is like," Zoe said, offering a small smile that seemed genuine. "I've never had a friend quite like her." The way she said it suggested Zoe hadn't had many friends at all. Connor found himself studying the dynamic between them, his grounded, sometimes melancholy daughter, and this mysterious, polished girl who carried secrets like other people carried textbooks. There was an ease between them that spoke of real connection. "Actually," Harper said, glancing between her father and Zoe, "I was thinking of inviting Zoe over for dinner this weekend, if that's okay." The request was casual, but Connor could see how much it meant to his daughter. Harper rarely brought friends home, and never since Margaret's death. The fact that she was asking now suggested Zoe had somehow broken through walls Harper had built around herself. Zoe's response was immediate and telling. "I couldn't impose," she said quickly, but her eyes held longing so intense it was almost painful to witness. "You wouldn't be imposing," Connor said gently. "We'd love to have you." The word love seemed to affect Zoe profoundly. She blinked rapidly, composing herself before nodding. "I'd like that very much," she said quietly. I don't often get invited to family dinners." As they made plans for Saturday evening, Connor found himself watching Zoe carefully. Her gratitude seemed disproportionate to a simple dinner invitation, suggesting a girl who'd been starved of normal family interactions. When she mentioned not having transportation, Connor offered to pick her up, noting how she hesitated before providing an address in the university district. Everything about Zoe continued to intrigue him and concern him. Saturday evening arrived with autumn's chill settling over Riverside. Connor had spent the afternoon helping Harper prepare their modest apartment, noting how excited she seemed about having a friend over. "She's really special, Dad," Harper said as she arranged flowers on their small dining table. "There's something about her that's different from other students, like she's older somehow, more mature." Connor agreed, but didn't voice his growing suspicions about exactly why Zoe seemed so mature. When Connor arrived at the address Zoe had provided, he found himself outside a modest apartment complex that seemed oddly anonymous. No personal touches, no signs of long-term residence. Zoe emerged wearing simple jeans and a sweater that probably cost more than Connor's monthly grocery budget, though she'd clearly tried to dress down. In the passenger seat, she seemed nervous in a way that suggested this was genuinely new territory for her. "Thank you for including me," Zoe said as they drove toward Connor's apartment. "I should warn you, I'm not very good at casual conversation. I've been told I can be too formal." Connor glanced at her profile, noting the way she held herself with perfect posture even in his old pickup truck. "Just be yourself," he said. "Harper clearly likes you exactly as you are." Something in Zoe's expression shifted at those words, vulnerability flickering across her features like candlelight. The evening unfolded with surprising warmth. Despite her concerns about being too formal, Zoe fit into their small family dynamic with an ease that surprised all of them. She complimented Harper's cooking with genuine enthusiasm, helped clear the table without being asked, and listened to Connor's stories about his security work with interest that seemed authentic. When Harper showed her the small shrine they kept for Margaret, photos and mementos arranged on the mantel, Zoe studied each item with respectful attention. She was beautiful," Zoe said softly, looking at a photo of Margaret holding infant Harper. "You can see the love in her eyes." Her voice carried a wistfulness that made Connor wonder about her own family relationships. When Harper explained about her mother's death from cancer, Zoe reached over and squeezed her hand with surprising tenderness. "I'm sorry you lost her so young," she said. "You're lucky to have had that kind of love, even briefly." The way Zoe spoke about love suggested she had little personal experience with the unconditional variety. As the evening progressed, Connor found himself watching her carefully. She seemed genuinely fascinated by the mundane details of their life, how they shared cooking duties, how Connor helped Harper with homework, how they'd developed their own family traditions after Margaret's death. "This feels like a real home," Zoe said at one point, looking around their modest living room with something approaching awe. When Connor drove Zoe back to her apartment that night, she was quieter than usual. "Thank you," she said before getting out of the truck, "for treating me like family." The words carried weight that suggested such treatment was rare in her experience. As Connor watched her walk toward the anonymous apartment building, he found himself wondering what kind of life had taught a 19-year-old girl to be so grateful for simple human kindness. The following weeks brought a pattern that filled Connor with both happiness and concern. Zoe became a regular presence in their lives, studying with Harper, joining them for casual dinners, becoming the friend his daughter had desperately needed. Harper's mood improved dramatically, her anxiety seemed more manageable, and for the first time since Margaret's death, their apartment felt like a home rather than a shelter. But Connor's security training kept raising questions about their new family friend. Her expensive belongings, her advanced knowledge of business and economics, the way she sometimes answered her phone with formal language that suggested professional relationships. It all pointed to a background far more complex than she'd revealed. Most telling were the moments when she'd forget to guard her speech, using terminology and references that suggested intimate familiarity with corporate and financial worlds. One evening in early November, Connor's questions found partial answers in the most dramatic way possible. Harper had been struggling with severe anxiety all week, culminating in a panic attack so severe that Connor rushed her to the emergency room. While they waited for test results, Connor called Zoe, knowing how worried she'd be about her friend. "I'll be right there," Zoe said without hesitation, her voice tight with concern. What happened next would shatter Connor's world and reveal truths he wasn't prepared to handle. Zoe arrived at the hospital 45 minutes later, but she didn't come alone. A convoy of black SUVs followed her into the parking lot, and when she emerged from the lead vehicle, she was accompanied by two men in expensive suits who moved with the practiced alertness of professional bodyguards. But it was the woman who stepped out of the second SUV that made Connor's blood turn to ice. Catherine Wells. Connor recognized her immediately from business magazines and financial news programs. CEO of Wells Tech Corporation, one of the largest technology companies in the country, worth an estimated $12 billion. She moved with the same controlled grace as Zoe, her steel gray hair and expensive suit projecting authority that could be felt from across the parking lot. When she approached the hospital entrance with her security detail, every person in the vicinity seemed to sense her importance. "Where is she?" Catherine Wells asked when she reached Connor in the waiting room, her voice carrying the kind of command that expected immediate compliance. Connor found himself standing instinctively, his military training responding to obvious authority even as his mind struggled to process what he was seeing. "Who's asking?" he managed to say, though he already knew the answer would change everything. "I'm Catherine Wells," the woman said, her piercing blue eyes studying Connor with unsettling intensity. "Zoe's mother." The words hit Connor like a physical blow. Zoe, his daughter's best friend, the girl who'd been eating dinner at their modest table, who'd seemed so grateful for simple family warmth, was the daughter of one of the most powerful women in America. Everything about their relationship had been built on a lie so massive, Connor couldn't begin to process its implications. Zoe appeared beside her mother, looking smaller and younger than Connor had ever seen her. Gone was the confident, mature young woman who'd charmed his family. In her place stood a girl who seemed to be shrinking under her mother's gaze, every aspect of her carefully controlled demeanor cracking under pressure. "I can explain," Zoe said quietly, but her voice carried the resignation of someone who knew explanations wouldn't be enough. "Explain what?" Catherine Wells cut her off, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "Explain how you've compromised our security protocols, how you've put this family at risk by forming unauthorized relationships." Her gaze swept Connor from head to toe, taking in his security uniform, his worn boots, his obvious working-class background. The dismissal in her eyes was complete and devastating. "And this is your friend?" Connor felt everything he thought he knew about Zoe crumbling around him. "Unauthorized relationships," he repeated, the words tasting bitter. Catherine's expression didn't soften. "Do you have any idea what kind of background investigation you've just triggered?" she asked. "Do you understand the security liability you represent to my family?" The clinical way she spoke about human relationships as security risks told Connor everything he needed to know about Zoe's upbringing. "Every person who comes into contact with my daughter must be vetted, investigated, and approved," Catherine continued, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. She gestured between Connor and Zoe with obvious distaste. "This is exactly the kind of uncontrolled interaction that cannot happen." Connor could see Zoe flinching with each word, her carefully constructed friendship with his family being reduced to a security breach and policy violation. Harper appeared beside them, discharged and looking confused by the crowd of expensive suits surrounding her father. "Zoe," she said uncertainly, taking in the scene with growing alarm. "What's happening?" Catherine Wells' attention turned to Harper, her expression calculating as she studied Connor's daughter. "You must be Harper," she said, her tone marginally softer, but still carrying unmistakable authority. "I'm afraid Zoe won't be able to continue your friendship." The devastation on Harper's face was immediate and complete. After months of emerging from her depression, after finding her first real friend since her mother's death, she was watching it all disappear without explanation. "I don't understand," Harper said, looking between Zoe and the imposing woman who'd apparently materialized to destroy her happiness. "Zoe, what's going on?" Zoe looked trapped between her mother's expectations and her genuine care for Harper. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears threatening to spill over. "I never meant for this to happen." Catherine Wells placed a firm hand on her daughter's shoulder, a gesture that looked supportive, but carried the weight of absolute control. "We're leaving," she announced. "Tonight. Zoe will be transferring to a more appropriate educational environment." Connor watched his daughter's world collapse in real time. The color drained from Harper's face as she realized she was losing another important person in her life. "But we're friends," she said plaintively, her voice carrying the heartbreak of someone who'd already lost too much. "Zoe, you can't just leave." The desperation in Harper's voice seemed to affect Zoe profoundly, her composure finally cracking as tears spilled down her cheeks. "I have to go," Zoe said, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry, Harper, I'm so sorry." Catherine Wells was already moving toward the exit, her security detail creating a protective corridor. As they reached the hospital doors, Zoe looked back once, her emerald eyes meeting Connor's with an expression that begged for understanding. Then they were gone, leaving Connor and Harper standing alone in the suddenly empty waiting room. The aftermath was devastating. Harper retreated into a depression deeper than anything Connor had seen since Margaret's death. She stopped attending classes, barely ate, and spent her days sleeping or staring at her phone, hoping for a message that never came. Connor tried to reach Zoe through the university, only to learn she'd officially withdrawn from all courses. Her dormitory room was empty, cleaned out so thoroughly it was as if she'd never existed. Connor's own sense of betrayal ran deeper than he wanted to admit. Over the weeks since meeting Zoe, he'd begun to feel something he hadn't experienced since Margaret's death, the possibility of expanding their small family, of finding happiness beyond mere survival. He'd started to imagine a future that included Zoe's brightness, her obvious care for Harper, maybe even something deeper between himself and the mysterious young woman who'd brought such warmth into their lives. Now he understood it had all been an illusion. Zoe wasn't the struggling student he'd imagined, grateful for their modest family warmth. She was the daughter of a billionaire, slumming among ordinary people until her real life reclaimed her. Every dinner they'd shared, every conversation about normal college experiences, every moment of apparent vulnerability, all of it had been performance by someone whose actual life was beyond his comprehension. The worst part was watching Harper suffer. She'd lost her mother to cancer, and now her best friend to circumstances beyond her control. Connor tried to explain what little he understood about Zoe's situation, but how could he make a 19-year-old understand the complexities of wealth and security when he barely grasped them himself? "She said she cared about me," Harper whispered one night, curled up on the couch they'd shared with Zoe so many times. "How do you just leave someone you care about?" Connor had no answer because he was struggling with the same question. If Zoe's feelings for their family had been genuine, how could she simply vanish without explanation? If their friendship had meant anything to her, wouldn't she have found a way to maintain contact? The silence was deafening and absolute, suggesting that everything they'd shared had meant far less to Zoe than it had to them. 3 weeks after Zoe's disappearance, Connor received a call that changed everything. Harper had been found unconscious in her dormitory room, an empty bottle of prescription medication beside her bed. The ambulance ride to the hospital passed in a blur of sirens and desperate prayers. Connor had already lost his wife. The thought of losing his daughter was more than he could bear. In the intensive care unit waiting room, Connor sat alone with his failures. He'd been so focused on his own pain over Zoe's deception that he'd failed to see how deeply Harper was struggling. His daughter had needed professional help, not his assurances that things would get better. She'd needed him to fight for her happiness, not accept that some losses were simply inevitable. It was nearly 4 in the morning when Connor heard familiar footsteps in the hospital corridor. He looked up to see Zoe approaching, no longer the polished young woman who'd charmed his family, or the billionaire heiress surrounded by security. She wore Harper's old university sweatshirt and jeans that had seen better days, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion and tears. "How is she?" Zoe asked without preamble, settling into the chair beside Connor as if the past 3 weeks hadn't happened. Connor stared at her, struggling to process her presence. "How did you even know?" he asked. Zoe's expression crumpled slightly. "I've been monitoring social media, hospital records, anything I could access to keep track of how you both were doing. When I saw the ambulance report—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "You've been watching us?" Connor asked, not sure whether to feel comforted or disturbed by this revelation. Zoe nodded, shame coloring her features. "I know how it sounds, but I couldn't just disappear completely. Harper means too much to me." The raw honesty in her voice caught Connor off guard. "Then why did you leave?" he asked, his own pain bleeding through his words. Zoe was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands folded in her lap. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Because my mother convinced me I was dangerous to both of you. She showed me security reports about kidnapping attempts on other wealthy families, explained how people like you and Harper could become targets simply by knowing me. She made me believe that caring about you was selfish, that staying would only put you in danger." The explanation hit Connor like a revelation. "So you left to protect us?" Zoe nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "But I was wrong. The danger isn't in loving people, it's in being alone. Harper is in that room because I abandoned her when she needed me most, because I chose my mother's fears over my own heart." Her voice broke completely on the last words. Connor found himself studying Zoe's profile, seeing past the expensive education and polished exterior to the frightened young woman beneath. "Your mother was trying to protect you too," he said quietly, in her own way. Zoe's laugh was bitter. "My mother tried to kill herself when I was 10 years old. Did you know that? She built her entire empire after my father left us, convinced that control and money were the only things that could provide security. She spent my entire life trying to eliminate every possible risk, including the risk of genuine human connection." The revelation cast Catherine Wells' behavior in a new light. Connor understood the psychology of trauma, how fear could become so overwhelming that it consumed everything else. "That's why she reacted so strongly to our friendship," he said, pieces clicking into place. Zoe nodded. "She saw you and Harper as threats to her carefully constructed world. But more than that, she saw how happy I was with your family, and it terrified her." "Because happiness meant vulnerability?" Connor asked. "Because happiness meant I might choose something other than the life she'd planned for me," Zoe corrected. "She spent billions of dollars creating a fortress around me, but what she really built was a prison. I just didn't realize it until I experienced what real family felt like." Her words carried the weight of someone who'd finally understood the difference between protection and suffocation. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of revelation settling between them. Finally, Connor spoke. What happens now? Zoe's expression hardened with determination he'd never seen before. Now I make a choice. I'm 19 years old, legally an adult, and I'm tired of living my life according to my mother's fears. I want to be here for Harper. I want to be part of your family if you'll have me. The offer was everything Connor had wanted during those weeks of silence, but it came with complications he couldn't ignore. Your mother won't just accept this, he warned. Zoe's smile was grim. My mother is about to learn that some things are more important than security protocols. Harper is fighting for her life in there because I wasn't brave enough to fight for our friendship. I won't make that mistake again. When Harper finally regained consciousness 18 hours later, the first face she saw was Zoe's. You came back, Harper whispered, her voice hoarse from the medical procedures. Zoe gripped her hand tightly, tears streaming down her face. I never should have left. I'm so sorry, Harper. I'm so sorry. Harper's response was immediate and fierce. Don't leave again. Please don't leave again. The reunion was interrupted by the arrival of Catherine Wells and her security team. Connor watched the CEO's face as she took in the scene, her daughter holding the hand of the girl who'd nearly died, both of them crying with relief and joy. For a moment, Catherine's carefully controlled expression cracked, revealing something that might have been understanding. Then her mask slipped back into place. Zoe, Catherine said quietly, we need to talk. But for the first time in her life, Zoe didn't immediately comply with her mother's request. Later, she said, without looking away from Harper. Right now, my friend needs me. The word friend was delivered with emphasis that made it clear Zoe wasn't backing down from her choices. Connor found himself face to face with Catherine Wells in the hospital corridor, two parents trying to navigate an impossible situation. She's not going to come with you, Connor said quietly. Catherine's expression was unreadable. I'm beginning to understand that, she replied. The question is whether you understand what you're asking for. The security risks, the media attention, the complications that come with being connected to our family. I understand that your daughter saved mine, Connor said. I understand that Harper has been happier with Zoe in her life than she's been since her mother died. Everything else is just details we'll figure out as we go. Catherine studied him for a long moment, a businesswoman's instincts clearly evaluating his sincerity and resolve. You have no idea what you're signing up for, Catherine said finally. But perhaps... She paused, something shifting in her expression. Perhaps Zoe has been right about needing something I can't provide. The admission seemed to cost her, but it also suggested a mother capable of putting her daughter's needs above her own fears. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a doctor with Harper's discharge papers. As they prepared to leave the hospital, Catherine made an unexpected announcement. Zoe will return to Riverside University to complete her education. Security will be discreet but present, and... She looked directly at Connor. I'd like to discuss establishing a scholarship fund for students like Harper, students who've overcome significant personal challenges. The offer was clearly Catherine's way of acknowledging the value Connor and Harper had brought to her daughter's life. It was also, Connor realized, her way of trying to build bridges rather than walls. That's generous, he said carefully. But we don't need charity. Catherine's smile was the first genuine expression he'd seen from her. It wouldn't be charity. It would be an investment in the kind of community that's been good for my daughter. 6 months later, spring had settled over Riverside with the promise of new beginnings. Harper had returned to her classes with the support of enhanced counseling services and had become an advocate for mental health awareness on campus. Her recovery wasn't complete. Healing from trauma never was. But she'd learned to reach out for help instead of suffering in silence. Zoe had also returned to Riverside, but her experience was different now. She still carried herself with the grace her upbringing had instilled, but there was a lightness to her that hadn't existed before. She'd learned to be just Zoe, not the Wells heiress with all the expectations and restrictions that identity carried. Her relationship with her mother remained complicated, but was slowly improving through family therapy sessions. Connor continued his work in campus security, but Catherine Wells had also funded a new position for him, coordinator of student safety and mental health initiatives. It was work that used his protective instincts and military training while addressing the kinds of challenges students like Harper faced. The irony wasn't lost on him that his connection to the Wells family had opened doors he'd never imagined walking through. The evening sun cast long shadows across the campus as Connor finished his patrol. In the distance, he could see Harper and Zoe studying together on the quad, their heads bent over textbooks, occasionally laughing at something one of them had written. The sight filled him with the kind of contentment he'd thought was lost forever when Margaret died. His radio crackled with routine updates from other security personnel, but Connor barely heard them. He was thinking about the phone conversation he'd had with Catherine Wells earlier that week. She'd called to discuss funding for additional mental health resources, but their conversation had drifted to more personal topics. "Zoe seems genuinely happy," Catherine had said, and Connor could hear the wonder in her voice, as if happiness was something she'd never expected for her daughter. "She's found her place here," Connor had replied, "with people who care about her for who she is, not what she represents." There had been a long pause before Catherine responded. "I'm beginning to understand the difference. It's taken me 50 years to learn what you've known all along, that love doesn't require control." The admission had cost her, but it also marked how far they'd all traveled from that night in the hospital. As Connor walked toward his truck, he saw Catherine's discreet security team maintaining their perimeter around campus. The compromise they'd reached wasn't perfect, but it acknowledged both the genuine security concerns of the Wells family and Zoe's need for authentic relationships. Some battles were worth fighting, and some victories were measured in small freedoms rather than complete independence. Harper appeared beside him as he reached the parking lot, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her expression more peaceful than it had been in months. "Ready to head home?" she asked, falling into step beside him. Connor nodded, noting how naturally she'd started referring to their apartment as home again. For months after Zoe's disappearance, Harper had spoken of their living space as just the place where they slept. "Zoe's coming for dinner tomorrow," Harper mentioned as they climbed into Connor's truck. "She wants to try making that pasta dish Mom used to make." The casual mention of Margaret no longer carried the sharp edge of grief it once had. Time and healing had softened those memories into something that could be shared rather than protected. "I found Mum's recipe cards," Harper continued. "I thought we could all cook together." The drive home passed in comfortable silence, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Connor found himself reflecting on how dramatically their lives had changed since that evening when he'd heard Zoe's scream across the campus parking lot. He'd intervened to protect a stranger, never imagining that act would lead to the expansion of their small family, and a kind of happiness he'd stopped believing was possible. At home, Harper disappeared into her room to continue studying, while Connor sat on their small balcony, watching the sunset over Riverside. His phone buzzed with a text from Zoe. "Thank you for not giving up on me. See you tomorrow." The message was simple, but it carried the weight of everything they'd been through together. The deception, the revelation, the separation, and the choice to rebuild something stronger than what they'd lost. Connor typed back, "Family doesn't give up on family." As he hit send, he realized the truth of those words. They'd become a family not through blood or marriage, but through the conscious choice to show up for each other despite the complications and challenges that choice brought. It wasn't the family any of them had planned, but it was the family they'd chosen. The evening air carried the sounds of college life, distant music, laughter, the hum of young people figuring out their futures. Connor closed his eyes and let the sounds wash over him, thinking about Margaret and how she would have loved Zoe's fierce loyalty to Harper. His wife had always believed that love expanded rather than diminished when it was shared, that opening your heart to new people didn't mean forgetting those you'd lost. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would always be security concerns to navigate, media attention to manage, and the complex dynamics of a relationship between families from vastly different worlds. But tonight, Connor felt something he hadn't experienced in years, complete peace with his choices and genuine excitement about the future they were building together. As darkness settled over Riverside, lights began to flicker on in dormitory windows and apartment buildings throughout the college town. Each light represented someone's story, someone's struggle to find their place in the world. Connor thought about all the students who felt lost or alone, who carried secrets or struggled with challenges that seemed insurmountable. Maybe tomorrow one of them would need help, and maybe Connor would be there to offer it. Inside the apartment, Harper was settling down for the night, her anxiety managed by medication and therapy, but also by the knowledge that she wasn't facing her challenges alone. Across town, Zoe was probably reviewing her coursework, but also texting with friends and planning weekend activities like any normal college student. And somewhere in a corporate boardroom or luxury hotel, Catherine Wells was learning to balance her protective instincts with her daughter's need for authentic relationships. They were all different than they'd been 6 months ago, changed by loss and discovery, by the risk of loving people whose lives didn't fit into neat categories. Connor understood now that some of the best things in life came from unexpected places, from moments when you chose to help a stranger or open your door to someone who needed what you had to offer. The last thing Connor saw before heading inside was a shooting star streaking across the clear Colorado sky. He didn't make a wish. He didn't need to. Everything he dared to hope for was already here, imperfect and complicated, but real in a way that security protocols and corporate strategies could never replicate. Tomorrow would bring new adventures for their unlikely family, and Connor was ready for all of them.